At 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands in August 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiral into the Pacific. 3 Japanese Zeros had bounced them from above, and now Bong was alone with the lead Zero closing on his tail. He executed the textbook defensive maneuver, a hard right bank with full throttle, attempting to outclimb the threat, but the Zero turned tighter. The Japanese pilot was already sliding into firing position, and Bong had perhaps 4 seconds before 20mm cannon fire tore through his aircraft. What happened next wasn't in any training manual. Bong rolled his P-38 completely inverted and yanked the stick forward. Instead of climbing away from the threat, his aircraft dove toward the ocean. But because he was upside down, he pulled away in a direction the Zero pilot never anticipated. Blood rushed to his head. His vision went red at the edges. For 2 critical seconds, he could barely read his instruments. When he rolled level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero was above him, overshooting, completely out of position. Bong had survived, and he just stumbled onto a tactic that would reshape air combat across the Pacific theater. This maneuver violated every principle taught at flight school. Instructors at training bases in California and Arizona specifically warned against negative G-flight, engine failure, structural damage, pilot incapacitation. The official position was clear. Yet in actual combat, when a Zero pilot had achieved firing position, those warnings mattered less than immediate survival. The pilots who lived through their first encounters with Zeros learned a harsh lesson. Conventional aerial combat doctrine was getting Americans killed. Japanese aviators had refined their tactics through years of combat operations over China. They understood every advantage their Mitsubishi, a 6M, possessed. American pilots were dying because they fought according to peacetime training against an enemy who had already discarded those rules. The story of inverted flight tactics represents something beyond standard military history. Between 1942 and 1944, a relatively small group of fighter pilots discovered that the human body could withstand physiological stresses aviation medicine considered impossible. They learned their aircraft could handle maneuvers engineers insisted would cause structural failure. Most importantly, they proved that sometimes survival required flying directly toward the threat rather than away from it. This wasn't the sanitized version of Pacific air combat that appeared in official after-action reports. This was desperate, brutal, innovation born from unforgiving necessity, where split-second decision separated pilots who returned to base from those who became names on casualty lists. The Mitsubishi A6M0 entered combat over China in 1940, and by the time America entered the war in December 1941, Japanese pilots had accumulated thousands of combat hours perfecting their tactics. The Zero's performance characteristics created a deadly problem for Allied aviators. At speeds below 300 mph, the Zero could outturn virtually any fighter in the sky. Its turning radius at combat speeds was roughly 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning, nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a traditional turning dog fight, the kind emphasized in American training programs, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his opponent's turn and achieve a firing solution within seconds. Early engagement reports from the Philippines and Java told a grim story. American pilots attempted boom and zoom tactics, diving on Zeros from altitude, firing, then climbing away. But if the initial attack failed to destroy the target, the Zero pilot would simply enter a tight horizontal turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, he found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy, becoming the target instead of the hunter. By mid-1942, kill ratios in some sectors favored Japanese pilots 3-to-1. Squadron commanders were filing reports that essentially admitted the same thing. We cannot win, turning fights against this aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, flown by Navy and Marine pilots, had superior diving speed and could absorb more battle damage, but its rate of roll was sluggish. The P-40 Warhawk performed well in vertical maneuvers, but suffered at higher altitudes where many engagements occurred. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines and heavy firepower, but its wide turning radius made it vulnerable in horizontal combat. Each American fighter type had advantages: firepower, armor, dive speed, but none could match the Zero's agility in conventional maneuvering combat. Pilots were told to use their aircraft strengths, avoid turning engagements, maintain energy advantage. Sensible advice, but combat rarely unfolded according to plan. What made this tactical crisis worse was the skill level of Japanese naval aviators. In 1942 and early 1943, many had been flying combat missions since the late 1932. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics at an expert level. They knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where the Zero's turning ability became decisive. A common Japanese tactic involved one Zero acting as bait, flying straight and level, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot committed to the attack, two more Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the flanks. The fighter was suddenly defensive, and defensive meant entering a turning fight, which meant the Zero's advantages became overwhelming. The mathematics of turning combat are unforgiving. Turn radius depends on velocity and G-force loading. The Zero's lightweight construction, achieved partly by eliminating armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it superior turn performance. American fighters carried armor plate behind the pilot seat, self-sealing tanks, heavier armament. These features kept pilots alive when hit, but they also added hundreds of pounds that increased wing loading and expanded turning radius. American pilots were essentially asked to defeat an opponent who owned the most important advantage in dogfighting. While flying aircraft optimized for survivability rather than maneuverability, the maneuver that would eventually save countless American lives wasn't derived from aeronautical engineering textbooks or tactical doctrine. It emerged from raw desperation and accidental discovery. The split S, as it came to be called, involved rolling inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. In normal flight, pilots experience positive G-forces. Blood is pushed toward their feet. Vision narrows, and at around 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots experience grayout or blackout. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, he experiences negative Gs. Blood rushes to the head. The effect is called red out because the visual field literally turns red as blood vessels in the eyes engorge. Aviation medicine in 1942 suggested humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces. Studies indicated that even -2 Gs cause severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. Official guidance recommended avoiding negative G flight entirely, but these studies were conducted in controlled environments. With test pilots who weren't being shot at, combat created different mathematics. A pilot experiencing 2 seconds of readout vision, but escaping a Zero's gun solution, survived. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight, but stayed in the Zero's crosshairs, died. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable. It was temporary blindness versus permanent death. The physics behind why the contest, inverted dive, worked involved energy management and opponent prediction. When a Zero pilot achieved a tail position, he anticipated the target would either try to outturn him, impossible, or attempt to climb away, which bled the American aircraft's energy and made it an easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't expect. More importantly, If the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through the maneuver, his aircraft faced structural limitations. The Zero was stressed for positive G, loads up to about 7 Gs, but it's lighter. Construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a Zero risked structural failure or engine problems because the aircraft systems weren't designed for sustained inverted flight. The P-38's twin Allison engines had another advantage in negative G flight. Unlike single-engine fighters with carbureted engines, which could experience fuel starvation during inverted maneuvers, the P-38's engines used different fuel systems that function more reliably under negative G loads. This wasn't a designed feature. Lockheed engineers weren't planning for inverted combat tactics, but it became operationally significant. A P-38 pilot could maintain power through an inverted dive. Some pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss, widening the separation, the human body's tolerance. For negative G forces turned out to be higher than medical literature suggested, provided the exposure was brief. Pilots reported that the readout effect lasted only a few seconds during a properly executed split. Vision returned as the aircraft transitioned back to positive G flight during the pullout. The discomfort was intense. Headaches, facial fatigue, bloodshot eyes, but survivable. Several pilots noted in debriefings that they'd rather endure a splitting headache back at base than a proper burial at sea. The informal risk assessment was simple. Negative G maneuvers hurt, but Japanese cannons hurt worse. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, was the first pilot documented to have used the inverted dive tactic, deliberately rather than instinctively. On April 11th, 1943, Lynch led a four-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf when his formation encountered 8 Zeros at 20,000 feet. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal fight, Lynch immediately rolled inverted when the lead Zero closed on him. He pulled through into a steep dive, accelerated to over 400 miles per hour, then rolled level at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot attempting to follow pulled out at 12,000 feet, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed. Lynch didn't just survive the encounter, he reversed the situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude separation and superior speed. He used that energy advantage to climb back up, this time approaching the now disorganized Japanese formation from below. The Zeros had lost their cohesion, chasing after what they thought were fleeing American fighters. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the ensuing engagement. His wingmen, following his example through the inverted dive, survived without losses. The after-action report noted the tactic, but didn't emphasize it. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G maneuvers. What made Lynch's action significant was intentionality. Other pilots had rolled inverted under duress, survived, and chalked it up to luck. Lynch recognized it as a repeatable technique. Within a week, he was teaching the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron during informal briefings. The instruction was simple. If a Zero gets on your tail, in a position where you can't shake him conventionally, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, and use the speed to separate. Don't try to outturn him. Horizontally, use the vertical dimension. The Zero owns the horizontal circle, but American fighters own the broad vertical dive. By June 1943, the tactic had spread to other P-38 units operating out of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared the technique during ready room discussions and inter-squadron debriefings. It remained largely unofficial, not prohibited, but not endorsed in formal tactical directives either. Squadron leaders recognized its effectiveness, but hesitated to put it in writing. Concern was partly liability. If a pilot was killed attempting the maneuver, questions would arise about who authorized teaching a tactic that contradicted established training. So it spread through word of mouth, experienced pilots showing newer arrivals how to execute it without documenting the instruction. The 475th Fighter Group, arriving in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943, received informal briefings on the inverted dive tactic from veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles McDonald, who would eventually become one of the Pacific Theater's leading aces with 27 kills, later credited the Split S maneuver with saving his life on at least 3 occasions. His combat reports from late 1943 show a pattern. Engage zeros from altitude, make a high-speed pass. If counterattack during the climb back up, roll inverted, and dive away. Reset the engagement on favorable terms. It wasn't elegant dog fighting. It was industrial strength, survival mathematics that happened to produce victory. The physiological cost of negative GF flight was something no training manual adequately prepared pilots for. During a typical Split S maneuver, pulling -2 to -3 GS, blood pressure in the head increased dramatically. Pilots reported an immediate sensation of intense pressure behind the eyes, followed by the red out effect, where their entire visual field turned crimson. The pressure came from blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva engorging with blood forced upward by the negative acceleration for those 2 to 3 seconds. A pilot was effectively flying blind, relying on kinesthetic sense and instrument memory to maintain aircraft control. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, documented the physical aftermath of these maneuvers. He examined dozens of pilots who regularly employed inverted dive tactics. Nearly all showed petechial hemorrhaging, tiny broken blood vessels, creating red spots across their faces, particularly around the eyes and forehead. Some experienced subconjunctival hemorrhages that left their eyes blood red for days. Severe headaches were universal. A few pilots reported temporary vision problems, blurred sight, or difficulty focusing that lasted several hours after landing. Moorhead's unofficial conclusion, never published in medical journals, was that the maneuvers caused measurable physical damage, but nothing permanently debilitating. The greater risk was the moment of blindness itself. During those few seconds of red out, a pilot couldn't see his altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. He certainly couldn't see the enemy aircraft or the ground rushing up. The maneuver required absolute commitment. A pilot had to establish the dive angle, pull the negative Gs, then hold that control input until his vision cleared, trusting that he judged his altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal accidents in training occurred when pilots initiated the maneuver too low or held the dive too long. There was no margin for error. At 5,000 feet, at 15,000 feet, a pilot had time to correct. The mathematical calculation became part of survival. Never go inverted below 8,000 FT unless death was otherwise certain. Experienced pilots developed techniques to minimize the readout duration. Some learned to tense their neck and facial muscles, attempting to restrict blood flow to the head. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but pulled less aggressively on the stick, trading maximum maneuver performance for slightly better vision, they could maintain partial sight throughout the maneuver. This became a judgment call. Maximum negative G input generated the fastest separation from a pursuing zero, but caused complete visual blackout. Moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to keep some visual reference, but reduced the effectiveness of the escape. In practice, most chose maximum separation. Better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than semi-aware and shot down. The psychological aspect was equally challenging. Human beings have strong evolutionary instincts against actions that cause pain and sensory deprivation. Voluntarily inducing temporary blindness while someone is trying to kill you runs counter to every survival instinct. Yet pilots learn to override that instinct. The first time was terrifying. The second time was still frightening. By the 5th or 6th time, it became just another unpleasant aspect of combat flying, like flak, like fuel management, like watching friends die. The body adapted, the mind adapted. What seemed impossible in a training environment became routine when the alternative was a 20 meters minute cannon shell through the cockpit. The inverted dive tactic moved through the Pacific theater like an underground transmission, spreading from squadron to squadron, without ever appearing in official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their first week in country. The instruction happened informally. Veteran pilots taking new arrivals aside after evening mess, describing what worked and what got people killed. Squadron commanders knew it was happening. Some actively encouraged it. Others pretended not to notice, maintaining plausible deniability in case 5th Air Force headquarters asked uncomfortable questions about unauthorized training. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, incorporated the Split S into his unit's tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, making it hopelessly outmatched in turning combat against Zeros. But the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the combat. Sky and its radial engine handled negative G flight reasonably well. Kirby's approach was pragmatic, he told his pilots explicitly that if they tried to turn with a Zero, they'd die. If they used the P-47's weight and power to dictate vertical engagements, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes, when necessary, they'd survive and win. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11th, 1943,